This is the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. And today, I got a question for you. Have you ever seen a black bear in Mississippi? Have you ever seen a picture of one in Mississippi? Did you know we have quite a few black bears here in the state of Mississippi? Well, the guy who knows all about it, he's going to fill you in and answer your questions today on the show. He is Anthony Ballard, the head of the Black Bear Program here at MDWFP.
This episode of the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast is brought to you by the Foundation for Mississippi Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks.
You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. And today we are talking about black bears with the Black Bear Program leader here at MDWFP, Anthony Ballard. Anthony, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the Black Bear Program. Where did that begin? When did it begin? And kind of how you came to intersect with that program here at MDWFP.
So the history of the black bear in Mississippi is one of a lot of ups and downs. They were very plentiful in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Big population declines in the early 1900s, 20s, and 30s, and then started, after a lot of protections were put into place, started to kind of come back up and have that population rise again. And so the Mississippi Museum of Natural Science does a lot of the, federally listed, animals, threatened and endangered species, that kind of thing. So it was something the museum did before Wildlife and Fisheries took it. And then in 2002, it went from the museum over to Wildlife and Fisheries. And that's when the bear program under Wildlife and Fisheries was born.
In 2002. So
2002, yeah.
Just a little over 20 years old.
That's right.
The program. And so who was kind of involved with that before you came along? You're too young to have been involved in 2002.
Yeah,
so.
Definitely. So Brad Young was our first bear biologist after it came to the museum. There were several other folks that were, in the museum and even involved with MSU that did work before that. But so Brad Young was our first bear biologist. He left, I think, in 2012, 13, and then Richard Rummel had it. They both had it right around 10 years. So he retired in November of 22, and then I took over in interim and then permanently in February of 23.
Okay. For you, all right, now let's go back and tell me sort of your path that led you to this, to now being the Black Bear Program leader here at MDWFP. How far do we go back in kind of your childhood, your history here in Mississippi to begin the story of how you wound up here?
Well, I always knew I wanted to do something with wildlife. People ask, what did you want to do when you grew up? There was never any question for me what I wanted to do. It was just a question of how exactly I was going to get there, what steps I was, the exact path wasn't known, but I knew I wanted to do something with wildlife since I was a kid. And so,
where'd you grow up?
Right outside Brandon.
Okay.
Yeah. So, local, born and raised here in central Mississippi. And so I remember talking to William McKinley, actually, our deer coordinator, in sometime in high school, and, talked to him about, hey, what do I need to do? How do I need to pursue this career? And, he gave me some tips and pointers that I followed all the way through school, and got my undergrad at Mississippi State and got my master's at UL Monroe. And I started here actually in the nuisance species program. So I did a lot of wild hog work and that kind of thing. And that's been, by far the bulk of my career up until this recent change in the past year or so.
How did that change happen for you? Like what conversation, how did the door open to go from the nuisance animal side of things to what you're doing now?
So there's some overlap, believe it or not, and also some things the experiences that I had. So for example, I worked at a veterinary clinic, during high school and college. And so I was able to be familiarized with, a lot of different drugs and how drugs worked and just generally, veterinary practices. And when you're working with bears, that's one thing that's kind of unique to that, because it's very common that you have bears under anesthesia and you have to know how those drugs work and antibiotics and different, medications. And so there was a lot of overlap there. And, obviously bear work is one thing that I always really enjoyed and would go out and help with as much as I could. And so it was never something that I really considered to be an opportunity for me, because it was like, hey, there's one bear guy, he's working, and that was pretty much it. And then whenever Richard retired, it was like, well, if there's an opening there, we could possibly. And So I was asked to do it in interim, and then after doing it for a little while, I was like, man, I can't pass this up. This is too cool. So applied and was hired on, permanently.
Yeah. So I guess beyond just the curiosity part of dealing with a bear, black bear, specifically in Mississippi, what drew you to that animal? What kind of drew you to that?
Probably the coolest part is the conservation story, because you have the white-tailed deer, the eastern wild turkey. All of these species have gone through the same sort of pattern as the black bear, but they've already made their ascent, and now they're a pretty ubiquitous game species, one that we really kind of take advantage now. Whereas the black bear is still on that path, and I think it'll be probably one of the last to make it full circle. And to be part of that story is something that's so cool. I mean, I just couldn't pass it up, because if my career plays out for the next, decade or so, however long, there's a pretty good chance that I'll be, the first one in Mississippi since the days of Teddy Roosevelt to implement a season in Mississippi. And that's just, if that's not a cool conservation story to be a part of, I don't know what is.
Yeah. When you said full circle, that's kind of what I kind of wondered. I wondered, okay, what is that picture, and how far out is that when that becomes a thing, when the population is to that point and we can kind of enjoy that as a sport. And I guess that's what it is. 10 years, is that the hope? Would that be best case scenario?
Well, I mean, that was a number of years that I threw out there, but really what it comes down to is the data. It's hard to project that kind of thing, because our estimates that we have right now, and that's one of the things that people ask me all the time. One of the first questions: how many bears do we have in Mississippi? And rightfully so, it's a reasonable question. But right now we're trying to get a new updated estimate. The one that we have right now is pretty outdated, and so once we get that, then we'll be able to bring a lot of that stuff into focus of, okay, how much more time might we need? What are some numbers that we might be looking at, and really get some concrete, building blocks in place to kind of start having those conversations.
All right. Where do bears live in Mississippi?
So in general, along the Mississippi River, and then like southwest and southern, like southeastern Mississippi.
Okay.
Basically South Mississippi and along the river, if you want to get really general.
Okay. So mostly western border area, south and southeast.
Right.
The occasional one that might be spotted in North Mississippi. So that's kind of just a rare stray.
For the most part, yeah. I mean, I actually counted it up. So between our Facebook group and the main website where we ask people, like the formal way that we ask people to record bear sightings, there's been, I think, 68 or 69 counties that there has been a bear sighted reporting since 2016.
Okay.
So, it's far from sporadic, I would say. There's some, I think there was like 35 counties that we considered to be quote unquote bear counties for an upcoming survey that we have that MSU's sending out. But, it's still localized, but definitely growing.
This may be the most novice question of all. Are they dangerous?
In general, no. Any wild animal can be dangerous. That's kind of what we tell people. And, I do presentations all over and get what if'd about different situations and all that, because, it's kind of a fear that people have. And, if there's anybody that should have been mauled by a bear, it should have been me or one of my predecessors, because we're going into bear dens. We're in close contact with bears all the time. And the fact of the matter is they don't want conflict. They don't want to be around people. And, when they do, they're trying to escape rather than trying to approach you or engage in any kind of, confrontation.
Yeah. A bear den. You've been in a bear den. What does that look like? What does a bear den look like?
So bear's den, for one of two reasons. It's a physiological thing to overcome food scarcity. So they'll build up those fat reserves and then go into the den to basically rely on those fat reserves to wait out a scarcity in food. And the females do it the pregnant females will go into the den. That's when they have their cubs. And so they're nursing and caring for those cubs while they're in the den until the cubs are mobile enough to come out and keep up with the sow after they emerge. So that's the main ways that they den. And now what the den might look like kind of depends on the habitat. So you can have ground dens, and those could be anything from, a depression in the ground, maybe some leaves and brush that have been kind of gathered together to make almost look like a nest. It could be something in a briar thicket along a log or a down tree, or it could be like what we see along the river in a lot of those flood-prone areas is tree dens. And so you can have a cavity, those big cypress that are several hundred years old, those cavities form inside those trees, and the bears get inside those cavities, and they'll crawl in a hole maybe 50 feet in the air, and that's where they den for the winter. How
about that? It's like almost like a giant squirrel nest up off the ground somewhere almost.
Well, it's and those cavities, it'll be like say a branch breaks off or something like that, and you've got that, that cavity, and it may be just a shallow depression in kind of the, the crotch of a tree, or it may be a cavity that runs all the way through the trunk, and the bear is literally on the ground, but the opening of the cavity is 40 feet in the air. So it just kind of depends on, how the selection process is what fascinates me, because how does a bear know what tree is a good cavity tree, but they find them, and they hang pretty tight to them. The females do anyway.
And so as a part of this program, there are times when you are head and shoulders, arms, whole body, in a bear den?
Yeah. So in the springtime, we do den checks, and that's usually the first couple weeks in March. And the reason we do that is to monitor reproduction. And so the females that we have collared that we can locate, we'll find those females, we'll locate the actual den site, and then we'll sedate that female and take the cubs and take measurements. So we're looking at things like if our female, if she should be having cubs, does she actually have cubs? How many is she having? What's the general health of those cubs? Because, from a population aspect, your reproduction and your survival is the biggest thing that's going to add to that population. And so it's sort of monitoring trends over time and looking at those research bears that you have to kind of take an inventory of that reproduction.
Yeah. Not scared at all? No fear of, has there never been any fear for you in encountering a bear up close?
Not really. It's kind of I don't know about a fear. It's an adrenaline rush.
Sure.
And it's not necessarily a fear of being, attacked or being charged or anything like that. It's more of there's so much riding on those den checks. There's so many things that have to go right, exactly right, that I feel a lot of pressure on me, because usually there's a lot of people involved. There's, we're trying to get content for education or for, whatever the case is. And there's so many things in a row that have to go just right with them in order for that final, picture where somebody's holding a bear cub. People have no idea how much stuff had to go right leading up to that for that thing to happen. So that's the main thing, is just kind of making sure that I do everything that I can to make sure that goes properly.
Yeah. So you mentioned in the spring is when that goes on. Throughout the rest of the year, what types of activities are a part of the normal operations for the bear program? Like, what are you doing throughout the year?
So the goal of our program is basically two-pronged right now. Is we're providing good, solid education. So we're providing education in schools, things like this, podcast, public presentations, that kind of thing, and just kind of spreading the word about living with bears, because most of our population, that's not something that really crosses their radar very often. And number two, our education, our research. And so, we're partnered with Mississippi State University. They've been an extension arm of Wildlife and Fisheries for decades now, and studied every critter imaginable. And so we've got several bears, I think 19 right now, that have GPS collars. And so those are constantly gathering data. And then we've got our students at MSU that have hair snares set up, and we're using those hair snares to get samples of hair, so we can so we can send those off and get genetic analysis. And so all of this research is in an effort to eventually get that good population estimate, and it's with MSU, and it's also kind of a multi-state effort too. And so depending on the time of year, summertime is usually trapping, and so it's still kind of sporadic right now, but going into June and July, it'll get a little bit better as far as being able to predict bear movements and being a little bit more predictable patterns. And so I've got, I think, 12 or 13 collars that I'm trying to trap bears and get out in Southeast Mississippi coming up these next few months.
Yeah. As you have tracked individual bears in Mississippi, like how far do they travel? Do they just kind of go in a big circle, looking for food, living, or do they just go straight line, long distances, come back? Like, what have you observed there?
So it kind of depends, depending on the sex and age of the bear. So generally a male is going to have a larger home range than a female. And generally an older, mature male is going to have a larger home range than more immature animals. That being said, most of the time when you see a bear that's just traveled, hundreds of miles or shown up in some strange place, like the video that of the bear that washed up on the beach and came up in the middle of everybody and ran through the beach in Destin. Yeah. When you see stuff like that, or a bear that ends up, in the middle of downtown somewhere, usually that's a young male that's dispersed away from that mature sow, the mama, and he's just going and trying to find a place to be a bear. And so in some of those cases, you can have bears that'll travel, hundreds of miles in order to finally establish that home range and kind of find a place to be a bear.
How about that? The idea of, a young male kind of finding where he's going to basically set up shop, like this is where I'm going to live. Doesn't that play, or I would guess it plays into a lot of the research that you're doing as that population grows, because we got, our human population, we got this bear population keeps growing. Eventually there's going to be a little more intersect. And those are, I guess that's the reason that research is important.
It's the reason the research is important. And it's also a reason that the educational is important, because at any given time, we've got enough bears in the state now where there's not a whole lot of places left where it really surprises me to hear that there's been a sighting. And, like I said, especially those young males, it's kind of like a spiked deer that walks out in a food plot in the middle of 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He doesn't know better yet. He's not as mature and he doesn't know the deal as well as, a more mature animal would. And so those males that are dispersing that time of year are more likely to get into, situations that are difficult for the public to deal with and make the news and cause a big uproar. Mm-hmm. And so the more education we could put out there about how to handle those situations, the better off, everybody can be.
How do we handle those situations?
Well, I mean, really the best answer to a lot of those is it depends. But, in general, we tell people that if you reduce or you remove the attractant, then you're going to remove the conflict. So most of that's in the form of food. So how do you get your dog to perform an action? How do you train your dog?
Give them a treat afterwards.
You give them a treat, positive reinforcement, right? And so what we see in these bears, whether it's dispersing bears or otherwise, they're going to be drawn to some type of food source. It could be trash. It could be a barbecue grill. It could be pet food that's left out on a porch. It could even be bird seed. A lot of people don't really think of that as being an attractant. A bear has a sense of smell about 7 times better than a bloodhound. They're very good at finding food, and they're very good at accessing that food when they do find it. And so that's what makes it so important to put that stuff away, secure it, because once you start attracting that bear, a bear doesn't want to be around people. He doesn't want to be around houses, cars, structures, that kind of thing. But if you're leaving those type of attractants out, you're literally training him to overcome those aversions because he's getting positively reinforced for it. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of our main things we're trying to get out.
So obviously something that could be food, and that there's a broad spectrum of that, could attract a bear, eventually. A sense of smell 7 times stronger than a bloodhound. I don't think I realized that. And that's strong.
Incredibly good, yeah.
And it makes me wonder, like for you and your work, how do you ever get close to one if they don't really want you to?
Well, so going back to the dens, a lot of people think of hibernation, quote unquote, as like this deep sleep where they go to sleep in the winter and they don't wake up until the spring.
Yeah.
And what we see, especially this far south, is it's more of there are sleeps and there is a suppression in metabolism and that kind of thing, but it's not to the point where it's like this involuntary comatose type of slumber. And those bears are very aware. I mean, a lot of the den checks that we did this past March, it was in the 70s and 80s. They absolutely knew we were there. And so we try to play the wind the best we can and approach as quietly as possible. But I've never gotten to a den where the bear wasn't looking me straight in the face. I mean, like they know she knows we're there. She's known that we were there for a while, and she's just tolerating us long enough for, hopefully for us to take a dark shot.
Yeah. which is totally healthy for anyone listening that wonders about that. A tranquilizer that works for how long while you study the den?
So the drug that we're using now, and going back to the veterinary stuff, this is very much like what you would see in a veterinary office. I mean, we've got supplemental oxygen tanks that we're bringing out there. So we run all our bears on O2. We're monitoring vitals, temperature, respiration, all that stuff gets done in the field. We've got, a truckload worth of equipment that we're bringing out there to do these procedures. And so once we sedate that sow in the den, one person is either in the tree if she's in a tree, or on the ground in the den, and we're monitoring her at all times. And then that person is passing cubs to other team members that are taking vitals and weights and measurements and everything on them. So everybody's under supervision at all times. And then that whole process usually takes roughly 45 minutes. And we've also got a reversal with these drugs. So it's a 2-part injection. And once we give that, depending on the metabolism and that kind of thing, generally 10 to 20 minutes, and they're back up fully awake and everything goes back to normal.
Wow. Yeah, I've seen the pictures of you like on the Facebook page of the little bear cubs sitting up on your shoulders. And so studying the cubs, it's weight and kind of monitoring their health at that and how old they are, I guess.
Right. Yeah. And I'll use Alabama as an example. They've got a population in the Mobile Basin down there. And there's been some questions about the vitality of the cubs. The weights have been really inconsistent. The number of cubs and survivalship has been kind of wonky. And that population is not growing as much as some other populations, say on the western side of Mississippi or even in northeastern part of Alabama. And so, what you can do by keeping tabs of, those cubs, overall health, weight, those types of things, is start to pick up things early. If you've got some kind of trend that's going to be a problem, the thought is there that you can identify that problem and make adjustments accordingly, versus all of a sudden going, oh, this bear population is not growing like it's supposed to. I wonder why. But if you're gathering that data on the, as you go, then you can look at trends and pick those up over time.
We talked about things that would attract them earlier. What are their natural food sources? For a black bear, the natural food sources in Mississippi, what would those be? So
like any other animal, it's going to be seasonal. So this time of year, it's a lot of, fruits and berries that are starting to come on. So later in the year, persimmons is a big one, muscadines, a lot of those naturally available, forbs and soft mass. Even acorns later on in the fall, you'll get, once the acorn drops start, they'll cash in heavy on those, especially in other parts of the country. And it can also, what a lot of people don't realize is, black bears also will eat a lot of insects too. So things like ants and termites, beetle larvae. So if sometimes you'll come across a log that's been completely destroyed and ripped apart. Well, a lot of times that was a bear that was digging through that log and finding little pieces of larvae and beetles and insects and stuff. I had a buddy in the Delta that was doing some work clearing trails and stuff in the summer, and he unfortunately accidentally found a yellow jacket nest. So he got popped a few times, and he went back to go get some poison and came back. And by the time he went back to his camp and came back, a bear had found that yellow jacket nest and dug up the entire thing, eaten all the larvae, and destroyed the nest completely. So there's some things that you kind of expect, and then some things that take a lot of people by surprise like that.
That takes me by surprise. I didn't know. And so they're not meat eaters.
Very little. Yeah, about 90% of the diet is some type of plant matter. And, will they take a fawn every now and then or something like that? Yes. But in general, they'd rather not have to chase what they're after. They're fairly, I'll say lazy, but they like to pursue things, kind of the path of least resistance there. And usually they can find things they don't have to chase.
Yeah. Convenience, right? Like,
there you go.
Like me stopping in the gas station, the convenience aspect of it draws me in there as well.
Yeah. If you had to run down your coffee, you may decide it was something for another day.
That's right. I might not like coffee as much if I had to chase it every day, to be honest with you. Trap designs. Now, you mentioned one earlier that was, a research sort of technique of you take the hair and send that off. Mm-hmm. But in terms of trapping, collaring, those types of things, I'm sure technology continues to advance in that arena as well. What are you looking at and dealing with now from an equipment standpoint?
So as far as our traps go, what we have been using in the past and has been used, don't get me wrong, it's called a lot of bears and it's been great, is what's called a culvert trap. And so as the name implies, it's a cylindrical trap, sometimes on sleds or a trailer, and it's basically a big mouse trap. So you've got some kind of trigger on the inside of that trap that has to be either pulled, a pedal to be stepped on, or whatever the case is, and that triggers a door, just a door to drop on the opposite side. So the bear walks in, triggers some type of release, and then causes the gate to fall. And the birth of the automated trap that I've started to use was actually in 2019, back during the flood. And I told you I came from the hog trapping side of things, and we've been using those automated hog traps, live stream camera capabilities for years now. And I was actually talking to the bear program guys at the time, and they were looking to trap some bears on the levee over in Vicksburg. And I said, well, why don't we just take the camera and battery and everything off of that trap and then just rig it up to drop a bear trap. And so some duct tape and zip ties later, we were able to rig that up and ended up catching like 3 bears in 4 days, putting collars on them, and it worked great. So one of the things that I did whenever I first kind of came into that was build a version of that, except all the electronics were already built into it. And so it's a lot bigger. It's sort of more of a rectangular trap, what they call a Cambrian style. It's all square tubing and expanded metal. And so the airflow is great through it. So you don't have to worry about getting as hot. But the best thing is I can monitor that trap at all times. So I know if I've got bait, I can select for certain bears if I want to. I can pick exactly what time that gate is going to drop. And, in the summertime, heat is a big concern. If you weigh 300 pounds and you're wearing a black fur coat, it's easy to overheat as it is, not to mention if you're under anesthesia, because they have an even harder time regulating that body temperature. And so that's one thing that we really have to be careful of, as far as the planning part of it, is like not only what the temperature is right now, but what it's going to be 3 hours from now, because we're trapping in places where, it's an hour or 2 drive just for me to get there. So that level of control that I've been able to get in that trapping style system has been completely invaluable. I trapped 19 bears with that system this past summer. Wow. And so it's been a huge help in, kind of picking my shots. A lot of places on the coast, it's a 3-hour drive. And I made 2 trips down. So I made 1 trip to actually bring the trap down, set the bait, get everything ready. My next trip down was to work the bear up, put the collar on, and take the trap and leave with it. And it's flexibility and control that's just completely invaluable.
And it just sounds like much more efficient.
Very much
all
efficient.
The way around.
Yeah. Because with the culvert style traps, especially in the heat of the summer, we have cameras that are monitoring when those fall, but we don't have any control of when they fall. So if there's a bear that goes in the trap at 12 noon and it's 98 degrees outside, the best case scenario is you're going to let the bear back out. If you can't safely work it up in that heat, now you just create a trap shy bear. Yeah. Whereas with this, you can let them come and go as you want to. Matter of fact, I did that last summer. I passed on a sow and cub twice in the absolute middle of the day in August when it was like 100 and something degrees, and was able to catch that same sow and cub over in October. And she's now one of our research bears. Now she's got a collar on.
Yeah, that's really cool. The collaring, Southwest Mississippi, along the river where the population mostly is it, are you, collaring the numbers that you want to? Is there a push to do more? Kind of where is that right now in your program? So
the original project that we had, so everything, there's projects that are kind of cyclical and go through time. And the project that we just recently, I guess in the stages of completing, we were hoping for 20 collars out. And we were able to do that last summer. We put all those collars out. And what I did over this past budget request was actually put in for 10 more. And so those recently came in just here a little while ago. There's been a couple other ones that dropped off. So I've got over 10 now that I'm looking to put out in Southeast Mississippi this year. And so the main focus was looking at movements in Southwest. But what this has given me the flexibility to do was to look at those and then also expand it into new areas. Again, maybe some of those younger males that are expanding into places we don't normally see bears, and look at movement patterns and get that much more data and that much more, usable information to add to the research that we're doing.
Yeah. So am I right? It almost seems the more that you have collared across a larger area, it's just that much more data you have to consume to decide, okay, these are the patterns, these are the movements, these are the areas, here's what we need to do.
Right. And it's regionally important too, because, we've got like a lot of our mature males in the South Delta, in that ag land, those big open spaces.
Yeah.
They'll have hundreds of square miles in a home range. And then you go down to Southwest Mississippi, and the habitat is completely different. So you've got a lot more tree canopy, a lot more timber, and a lot more topography down in those hills, around Woodville and that kind of stuff. And the home ranges look completely different. They're a tenth of the size as some of the ones we've seen in the Delta, even on the same age class and the same age class males.
Yeah. So,
going into different regions, and then of course your collared females, that's more that you're going to get to do den checks on in the future. And so that's all just basically, it's a force multiplier as far as how much data you can collect and analyze in a given project.
Yeah. What's the biggest, largest black bear that you've run into in Mississippi?
So me personally, so far has been 384. And that was one that we collared. Actually, we didn't collar that one. We trapped him in Claiborne County.
Okay.
And then there was one that we caught and collared in Roxy in Franklin County, or just north of Roxy, and that one was 381. So they were right there together.
380 pounds.
Yep.
On the black bear scales, I'm unfamiliar. I mean, that's on the upper end, or that's average?
It's on the upper end no matter where you go.
Okay.
Now you'll hear, especially like Virginia and the Carolinas, you'll hear a bear every now and then. It's like 600-700 pounds. But those are pretty big outliers, and they've had a lot of age and a lot of food, and it's physically possible for a bear to grow that big, but that's far from the average. And so the biggest one we have here in Mississippi on record was 468, and that one was a roadkill down in Wilkinson County. And so I've got some other ones that I've got pictures of that I think will probably give that one a run for its money. So probably scaring 500 pounds to death.
Scaring 500
Anthony,
pounds.
is that the one that we have down at the fountain?
That's the one downstairs, yeah.
Okay.
How long ago did that happen, the roadkill?
I'm really not sure. I want to say it was 5 to 10 years ago.
Okay, so not that long ago, actually.
No, it was pretty recent, yeah.
I mean, what would that do to a vehicle? I just have to wonder.
A lot.
I mean, that would be another reason to kind of understand long term where the populations are and what the movements are like, because again, I mean, it's a crazy thought, but I guess hypothetically you would want to take control if you had a situation where there was a major 4-lane highway and you had multiple bears crossing that highway all the time. If you knew that, you'd want to do something about it, right?
Yeah, and typically, I mean, highways can serve as a barrier for a lot of species.
Yeah.
Depending on the species, kind of depends on how much of a barrier it really is. Bears tend to stay, they don't regularly cross highways quite as much. I guess it really depends on the personality of the bear. Most of the time when you have vehicle strikes, it's a young male that's dispersing and really, doesn't really know the ropes yet, and he's also traveling long distances. And another thing that they've seen is, if there's bears that get relocated and they're trying to find their way back to where they were captured, a lot of times that results in collisions too.
Yeah, if they're relocated.
Yeah, which we don't, by the way.
Right, you don't relocate.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I kind of want to touch on. That's another common question that I get is, can you relocate this bear? I've talked to a lot of landowners trying to get research collars out there and that kind of thing. And I say, hey, would you mind if I come trap bears on your place? And they said, sure, can you relocate it? And it's like, well, no, because for a lot of reasons. Tennessee did a study, and they put GPS collars on bears that they were relocating. So they take them from one place, and we're talking about 50 to 60 miles, not just down the street. So they're dropping them off different places. And 2/3 of the bears that they collared found their way back to the original, sites that they captured them at. And the majority of the ones that didn't got hit by cars en route to trying to find their way back. And, another thing that I tell people is, so let's say that there's a bear that's causing some kind of problems and I agree to relocate him. If he's learned those behaviors and he's become habituated to, keying in on food sources and seeing people as a food source and lost that fear of humans, then that's something that he's learned. So if I take that bear out of that situation and then I move him somewhere else, he's going to repeat that same behavior. So I haven't solved that problem. I've just moved it and I've now created a problem for somebody else. And so it's really kind of a no-win situation as far as relocating bears. It's been shown over and over to be, pretty ineffective. And that's why it's so important, going back to the education part of it, is not to create that habituation in the first place, because it's very difficult. It's a really difficult situation once it starts to occur.
Yeah. So, and let's cover this. Currently, there is no season on black bear hunting season in Mississippi.
Right. State protected species.
It's a protected species. Under no circumstances should anyone try to take it in their own hands if they've got an issue.
Right.
And so for those listening, you never know. I think I actually know someone in Vicksburg who sometime in the last year, she called you, I think, because she had one in her yard in Vicksburg.
I think I know who that was. Yeah.
Yeah. So like that, what's the advice to someone listening who, if they wake up one day, they hear a noise out on the back porch, or it's at the hunting camp or whatever, what's protocol? What do they need to go through?
So again, this depends on the exact situation. And so this is where you can get into the what if game. But in general, you want to do something to try to scare the bear away, because like I said, that bear is there in the first place because he's received positive reinforcement of being around people and houses. So the more negative reinforcement you can introduce, you can kind of try to counteract that behaviorally. So you want to try to make as much noise as you can, pots and pans, car alarm, air horn, anything like that. You want to try to get the bear away from the premises and scare it away. That's the first step. Second step is going to be figure out what that bear was after. Most of the time it takes that long to go to an area and figure out what the initial attractant was. So it could be, some people have beehives that are right there close to their house. But most of the time it's going to be something we've talked about already. Those barbecue grills, pet food, garbage that's been left out, that kind of stuff. And so usually it's a pretty easy fix for that kind of thing. Some stuff's a little bit tougher, but for the most part, it's as simple as keeping that stuff secured and minimizing that conflict.
I have to ask a question that 12-year-old me or 10-year-old me would want to ask. What do those black bears smell like? And their den, you go in head first into a bear den. Like, what does black bear smell like?
Well, the dens are actually really clean.
Really?
And there's different levels of preparation, I guess you could say. Like some of them have been, you could tell, like there's been a lot of work done, and they've brought stuff in to kind of pad everything. But in general, they're extremely clean. But as far as the smell, they kind of smell like a really sweet wet dog. If that makes sense.
Okay.
But best thing I could say is you come on bear workout with me one day and you can do all the smelling you want to.
I was wondering if you were going to bring that up. I will admit I'm unsure. I think I'd be fine though with you. And you've taken guests, a lot of times to go and help you with the work, right?
Yeah. We take, it's not a one person operation.
Yeah.
Those workups. Usually I try to keep it around, 5 to 8 people. That's generally kind of a sweet spot where there's not too many people where it's cumbersome logistically, but there's enough people, to do things. And when I do this, it could be a lot of times the landowners involved, if they can be there, friends and family members of the landowners. That's kind of one thing that we try to get them involved. It's like, hey, you're letting me on your property to do this. Y'all feel free to come out and see how everything works. Of course, we'll have our staff, sometimes wildlife for enforcement. And but one thing I try to do before we go in is everybody has a job. And so if it's your job to put together the weigh pole and help get a weight on the bear, that going in. If it's your job to do something else, or if you don't have a job, you also know that. Where that way, when everybody goes there, it's time to jump into action and everybody knows what they're doing rather than going, oh my gosh, it's a bear. What do I do now? And you're kind of, clamoring to get everything. And so that's one thing that I started when I first kind of got into this And it's been a huge help, because it's one thing to be like part of the guy on the crew, and it's a whole nother thing to be running the whole operation. And so that's one thing that I did really, really early that I'm glad I did.
And so the population of the black bear in Mississippi right now, estimated as what?
There's really not an estimate.
Okay.
And the old estimate that's, 15 years old or so was 150 to 300. Okay. We have a lot more than that now. Mm-hmm. But like I said, once we get, nobody wants to know that number more than I do. But, once we get that new updated estimate, then we'll be able to put that out there to people. And that's going to answer a lot of questions and go a lot. It's going to help the program forward a lot. And
so more collars, new technology from a trapping scenario, all of that stuff, support for the black bear program, all of that plays a factor into getting to that point where you really feel like you've got a pretty firm grasp on estimating and, getting a new estimate on the numbers. Yeah, because you can't, when you get to the point where you're implementing a season, especially on something as consequential as the black bear, you better have done your homework. You better not be guessing at anything. You've got to have data to validate every claim that you're making. There's no guesswork that should be involved. And so that's one thing that I'm really pushing towards, is to make sure that we have crossed our T's and dotted our I's. And when it does get to that point, because there's a lot of opposition to a bear hunting season that will come, and so the more that we can do our due diligence on the front end to make sure that, you may be opposed to it, you may not like it, but there's not anything there's no criticism you can level at the pro hunting, agency, I guess you could say, in this situation, where we didn't do something that we were responsible for making sure, that data collection and everything's on solid footing. Yeah. And for you personally, the last thing for me, I hear you talk about it, and there's sort of a vision and an outlook down the road, and you can kind of see what that can look like, best case scenario down the road. And I just get the sense that for you personally, your feet hit the floor each morning, and there's a real sense of purpose in doing this every day. And it's a neat thing for me to kind of view it from a distance of you and your connection to this very unique species wildlife here in Mississippi. Is really cool. Yeah. And like I said, to be in the position that I'm in, to be potentially one of the closing chapters of, or at least, the completion of a chapter of one of the greatest conservation success stories in North America, the black bear, it really is an honor. It's humbling that I'm in this position at the time that I'm in. And, I've only been in this position a year, so there's been a whole lot of other people before me that, I'm standing on their shoulders. They've done the work and done when there was only a handful of bears in the state, and we've got 20 years worth of research. And that's another thing that I kind of want to bring about and bring to the public's understanding is, there's a lot of cool stuff that's already out there that, just hasn't been talked about as much. And so to highlight some of that historic stuff, I think is important too. And tell the whole story of where we've been and where we're going. Really cool. Yep. Anthony, thanks for being on the show. Enjoyed it, man. Yeah. That's Anthony Ballard. He is the head of the Black Bear Program at Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks. Thanks for listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. We'll see you outdoors.